I have a reputation for my conciseness and my brevity, right? So, let me just say, if you have to get up and leave, I understand. You know, I don't know how long this can go. This can go and go and go. Maybe I'll start to throw some stuff away as we go. But hopefully I'll be able to point out a few things to you that maybe you haven't noticed before. And as I say, the kind of the intention of this is to look at this, to look at these events of what happened during this week, starting with today, that the way they would have been viewed by a first century Jew. Because there are a lot of things that, unless you really stop and look at them, they don't make a whole lot of sense. So, we'll start, we won't waste any time. We'll start, can everybody hear me okay that wants to hear me? Yes, okay. I'm using the microphone not just because I'm getting over a cold. That's why I didn't give out communion today. I'm doing better, but you know how it goes. When you push yourself, you start relapsing a little bit. So I figured, well, let me make use of the microphone and not strain my voice. So we'll start by, we'll pray by just reading, not, this Sunday, probably one of the most torturous Sundays in some way, because not only do we have to listen to what is the longest gospel of the year practically, but we got to stand for the whole thing, you know. You know, you keep turning the page. How much longer do we have to stand for this, you know? So we're not going to, don't worry, we are not going to read that whole gospel again, but we'll take little snippets out of it. And to help with the, that's what I gave out little scripture passages here so that I could refer to them. And they're numbered, so as we go through them, I could just say, look at number this or number that, okay? So we'll open, with a sense, with a prayer, and the prayer we'll open with is we'll reread the first gospel we heard, the short one, the one that we heard outside in the portico, right? That said, it's from Mark. We're in the year of Mark. You won't know that, right? This is year B. Year A is for Matthew. Year B is for Mark. Year C is for Luke. John gets interspersed throughout. We're going to hear John's Passion on Good Friday. That's when he gets read. So there are a couple of things even in this first gospel today that I think need explaining. It said, and when they drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethphage at Bethany, at the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples and said to them, go into the village opposite you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find a colt tied on which no one has ever sat. Untie it and bring it. If anyone says to you, why are you doing this? Say, the Lord has need of it, and will send it back here immediately. And they went away and found the colt tied at the door out in the open street, and they untied it. And those who stood there said to them, what are you doing while untying that colt? And they told them what Jesus had said, and they let them go. And they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their garments on it, and he sat upon it. And many spread their garments on the road, and others spread leafy branches with which they had cut from the fields. And those who went before and those who followed out cried, Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the kingdom of our father David that is coming. Hosanna in the highest. So let me do a quick memory check here. See who remembers. What does we say Hosanna? Every time we go to Mass, we say Hosanna, right? What does Hosanna mean? Anybody remember? It's a distinctively, actually, it's an Aramaic word. Jesus spoke Aramaic, right? Hosa in Aramaic means save. And when you add the suffix na in any Aramaic word, it's like saying, now please. So, Hosanna, which Catholics all over the world say all the time, yet I don't think anybody knows what they're saying. We're saying, save us now, please. Hosanna. Okay? So, okay, that's just a little tidbit. Now you know. You can go teach other people what Hosanna means. There's a Hebrew version that's not Hosanna. It's a Hosanna Yesha or something like that. So, but they spoke Aramaic in those days, Jesus in that region. So, Mark has a couple of distinctive elements. For one thing, he brings out a point that no one else brings out. He says that they get a colt that no one has ever sat on. Now, if you read the other Gospels, if you read Matthew's Gospel, for example, he tells you why that's happening. He tells you it's to fulfill the prophecy of Zechariah, the prophet Zechariah. You have it on your sheet there. It's number 2, where it says, "Exalt greatly, O daughter Zion. Zion is Jerusalem. Shout for joy, O daughter Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. A just Savior is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." So, okay, Matthew would tell you that, he's going to tell you that explicitly. He's going to say fulfilling Scripture. Mark doesn't do that. Right? He just assumes you know that, I guess. But he does tell you something that no one else says. He says it's a donkey that no one has ever been ridden on before. Why does he tell us that? Why that detail? Why is that an important detail? Let me ask you a question. What happens, anybody here have experience with horses or donkeys? I bet you some, yeah. What happens to a horse or a donkey that's never been ridden before if you get on it? Not good, right? Yeah. But does Jesus get thrown off the donkey? No. He just rides it. One of the things we've been looking at a lot of these things at our Sunday morning, our little scripture study class that we have in the activity center, where we just look in detail at the readings for that Sunday. But one of the big themes in Mark's gospel, a really big theme for him, is that Jesus is the new Adam. That Adam, the first Adam, screwed up, right? But Jesus came and now he's going to get it right. So it's like going back to the Garden of Eden. When Adam, before he sinned, before the fall, was in the Garden of Eden, the Lord said, you have mastery over all these animals. He lived with wild animals. And there were no issues, no problems. It was only after the fall. If you remember, for this Lent, for this season of Mark, that on the first Sunday of Lent, where we read about the temptation of Jesus in the desert, Mark does the same thing there. No one else does this. He said Jesus was led out into the desert by the Spirit, where he was among the wild beasts. Right? Now, what happens in a desolate place when you're among the wild beasts? You get eaten. You get eaten. It doesn't go well for you. But Jesus didn't have any problems with the wild beasts, because as the new Adam, the sinless Adam, the Adam before the fall, he is the master of all. He is the master not just of humans, but of all creation, including the wild beasts. So what Mark is trying to show us here is, once again, Jesus is a new Adam. The idea of the donkey that has never been sat on before, in a certain sense, that kind of reminds you, looking forward, about, remember, Jesus was laid in a tomb, a brand new tomb, right? A tomb that no one was ever in before. The church fathers would refer to this as a virgin tomb. Now, why is that important? Why is it important that Jesus got buried in a tomb that no one was ever buried in before? Because then there is no question about who came out of that tomb. If there were other people that could have been in that tomb, who came out of the tomb? Who knows? Right? So it kind of looks ahead to that too. It looks ahead to a virgin tomb. So Jesus sits on this virgin donkey, so to speak, and yet has no trouble. The donkey is a sign also of humility. A horse wouldn't make sense. A horse would be what a warrior would use, a soldier would use. So quite intentionally, it says even in Zechariah, the donkey is the sign of humbleness, a sign of humility, not like a horse. The other thing, too, that we have to remember, that we're coming into the Feast of Passover, and we're thinking we're going to try as much as possible to get into the mind of first-century Jews. Passover is a pilgrimage feast. You must go to the temple to celebrate the Passover. There's some restrictions. Men over the age of 20, and you don't have to travel hundreds of miles back then, but there are some, but pretty much everybody in that region had to go to Jerusalem. When Jesus was lost in the temple, that's what Mary and Joseph were doing with Jesus, right? They were going up into Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. So what do you do on a pilgrimage? You walk. People, back then, it's not like they had the option of riding their golf cart or something like that, like we would today. But even to this day, people walk when they go. We had a pilgrimage to our shrine here from our mission parish in Brantford there. Remember what they did? They walked. They walked from, boy, oh boy, right? They walked from Brantford to High Springs to the shrine. Maybe they got rides back, I don't know. But that's always a sign of humility. So everybody is walking except one person. The Jews back then would have recognized, as foretold in Zechariah, that the one who rides into the city on the donkey is going to be the Messiah. So another element here, and this all, you have some of it on your sheets there, I'll show you. A second element here that Mark highlights, it's really a common thing everybody would know, is that people cut leafy branches and so forth from the tree and laid it along their road, including laying their garments on the road to welcome Jesus. This was a common custom. It was associated with a royal procession. On number 3 on your sheet there, I just took out of the 2nd book of Kings, when Jehu was anointed king of Israel, look what they did. Each one took his garment, spread it under Jehu on the bare steps, blew the horn and cried out, "Jehu is king." I also put number 4 there for you. When King David was, when Solomon was being installed, you see, David said, "Call Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, Benaiah and Jehoiah." When they had entered the king's presence, he said to them, "Take with you the royal, go, my son, mount Solomon on my mule and escort him into Gihon." So King Solomon also rode on a mule, a donkey, when he entered into Jerusalem. And Jesus again is seen as the new wise King Solomon. All these Old Testament figures, in a sense, are types. They're typifying the one who is to come. One of the big psalms for Jews this time of the year are the so-called Hallel Psalms. 116 through 118, some say 113 through 118. Hallel is Hebrew for praise. Now look at Psalm 118. We're going to come back to Psalm 118. "Lord, grant salvation. Lord, grant good fortune. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. We bless you from the house of the Lord. The Lord is God and has enlightened us. Join in procession with leafy branches up to the horns of the altar." So there again, you see the idea of cutting off leaf. I'll get back to this horns of the altar, which I highlighted there. I'll come back to that in a minute. But the leafy branches was a common royal custom for either when an army was returning from victory or when a king was being anointed. I put in there from Maccabees, when during the Maccabean Wars, when Simon reclaimed Jerusalem, they welcomed him as the victorious king. And what do they say? The Jews entered with shouts of praise, waving palm branches, playing the harp and cymbals, and singing hymns and canticles, because the great enemy of Israel had been crushed. So all of this is a common thing. It's sort of like, you're not surprised to see a parade on Memorial Day, right? It's a common thing, right? Same thing there. If a king is entering the city, this is something that's expected. Mark also includes something that's unique. No other gospel says. Mark adds that it's a kingdom of David. Right? We read in the gospel, "Blessed is the kingdom of our father David is coming." So they recognize the coming of the kingdom of God in Jesus, but they interpret it as one like the kingdom of David, which is an earthly kingdom. It's not going to be an earthly kingdom, it's going to be a heavenly kingdom, but that's something they're going to have to learn. Yet, it's so important are those words that every time we celebrate the Eucharistic liturgy, we are welcoming Christ our King because we say those very words. Blessed is he who comes comes in the name of the Lord. Okay? So there's a liturgical mystery being enacted there. Every time we celebrate the Mass, we recall the words of those welcoming Jesus into Jerusalem. So the people, it's clear, they're welcoming Jesus as a king entering the city. Now, normally, what the king would do then is dismount from the donkey, or if it were a warrior king, dismount from his horse, and then he would ascend the steps of the throne. Right? Now, Jesus is going to kind of do that, sort of, right? They would understand him to ascend the steps of some throne, some golden throne, and rule over this earthly kingdom. The church fathers saw this procession as that, exactly, the king entering his royal courts and so forth, but the kind of throne that this king would mount would be the throne of the cross. He's going to reign from the cross. So this story, in a certain sense, remember how I told you, it's like another parable of Jesus. Remember how I told you many times in the past that the parables of Jesus are really like riddles? They take an ordinary, everyday event that people were accustomed to, but then something unusual happens, something that you would never expect. That's the hyperbole way of teaching, right? And it causes you to stop and think that what was supposed to happen didn't happen, but then you looked at what happened and you say, oh, I get it now, maybe. Okay, so it's like he's going to be a king, all right, but he's going to be a crucified king. He's not going to be an earthly king garbed with gold and fancy stuff and so forth. He's going to reign from the cross. Notice also, in terms of reigning from the cross we see as the altar in our church, right? And Psalm 118, remember it said, bring it up to the horns of the altar. In your handout, I put a picture of what the altar looked like at that second temple, and actually even the first temple in Jerusalem. You see how it had those four horns at the end of at each corner. We could spend a lot of time just talking about that. So the best explanation, the simplest explanation, now, I have an old friend, older than me, a Jewish lady, a little frail thing, Once I was at her house and she was trying to open a jar and she couldn't, so she gave it to me, could you open this jar? And I opened it with no problem and she said, oh, big strong bull, That's the idea of the horns on the altar. That God could intervene, the altar is where the sacrifice was offered, right? And God could intervene on that altar with the force, with the might of an ox at any time he pleases. So that's what the horns of the altar are. I put on your sheet there, number 7. It talks again about the sacrifice of a bull. It's going to be slaughtered. They're going to put some of its blood on the horns of the altar. Again, the horns indicate again that God has the strength, unbelievable strength, and can do what he wishes with that sacrifice. Now, notice also the cross has 4 horns, doesn't it? Yeah? Right? A nail here, a nail here, a nail at the feet, and a nail at the head. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Right? So even the altar of the cross is seen as having 4 horns. And so you can see a lot going on here from a Jewish perspective that people of the first century would get. They would get this. The disciples would get it. Remember, the disciples had 3 years worth of teaching from Jesus himself. Not only were they devout Jews, but they had a round-the-clock, 24/7 Bible study with Jesus, so to speak. So they certainly got this. So that's Palm Sunday. Yeah, there's more we could talk about. We got. Look at the time already. Let's get into Monday and Tuesday of Holy Week. We never hear much about that, right? There are actually two things, important things that happen on Monday and Tuesday of Holy Week. Jesus curses a fig tree. We'll look at that. And that's when he cleanses the temple. Maybe I should preface this by saying, we're looking at Mark's Gospel. When did Mark write? Mark wrote about 30 years or so, roughly, after the death of Jesus. Mark wrote in the 60s, right? Who was Mark? John Mark was his name, actually. He was Peter's scribe. He traveled with Peter to Rome, okay, where Peter was martyred. Okay? And what he did at one point, and this is in the Acts of the Epistles, in a lot of places, he decided that on his own initiative, he was going to write down what Peter was teaching. And Peter was aware of it, and he had no problem with it. He said it's good that he's doing that, and that's where we get the Gospel of Mark from. Now, if you were to write about something that happened 30 years ago, any of you, how well would your memory be, right? What would happen? Things would be saying like, oh wait, I forgot, you know. So Mark's gospel is not a chronological gospel. Right? Mark wrote things as he remembered them. So you gotta do some work when you're reading Mark and read in between, well not even read in between the lines, but read carefully what the words are saying and then reshuffle these passages so that they do appear chronologically. So keep that in mind. Mark's gospel is not a chronological gospel. This is Mark writing down what he remembered from what Peter has said from 30 years before. Okay, and we'll look at so on number 8 on your sheet there is the cursing of the fig tree. On the following day, now if it's in parentheses, that means I put it in for clarity. It's not in the gospel itself, okay? So that, i.e. Monday after Palm Sunday, that's not in the Bible. I added that to make it clear. On the following day, that would make it Monday after Palm Sunday, when they came from Bethany. We heard today that they were in Bethany, right? Jesus was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard that. As they passed by in the morning, that would make it Tuesday of Holy Week, they saw that the fig tree had withered away to its roots. And Peter remembered and said to him, "Master, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered." Isn't that strange? Isn't that odd? Why would Jesus curse a fig tree? There's a general rule. I'm going to give you, if you want to read more on some of this stuff, I'm going to give you three good books at the end to recommend for you. But as a general rule, when you read something in the New Testament that doesn't make any sense, like this, it doesn't make any sense, but Jesus would curse a fig tree. When you read something that doesn't make any sense, that's a trigger, a clue. Go back to the Old Testament to see what's going on. For this one, we have to go back to the book of Genesis. And once again, Adam and Eve in the garden. Remember, this is Mark. And for Mark, Jesus is the new Adam, right? Common understanding is that the tree of knowledge of good and evil, it was what kind of a tree? An apple tree, right? Everybody says an apple tree. Of course, you know that's not in the Bible, right? Nowhere in the Bible does it identify the kind of tree that it was. Right? In all of Genesis, there's only one tree that gets mentioned at all. Or one kind of tree that gets mentioned at all. And that's in Genesis 3, verse 7, after the fall. It's number 9 on your sheet. After Adam and Eve sinned, then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. Again, this is not in the Bible per se, but ancient Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, ancient Jewish teachings, because of this, have always associated the tree of knowledge of good and evil with the fig tree. For Jews at the time of Jesus, and long before too, and the fig tree was the symbol of the tree of death. Now, Jesus enters into Jerusalem triumphantly. Knows he's begun his mission of salvation to destroy death definitively as the new Adam. What does he say to the symbol of death? What does he say to that tree? May no one ever eat of your fruit again. Now does it make sense? Jesus is cursing the tree that brought sin and death into the world. So much so that very next day, is Dick Furter here? He would have to go and get his tractor and dig out that tree. Because why did Jesus go and do that? I got to get this tree out of here. Right? The tree is dead. The other thing Jesus did on that Monday, Tuesday of Holy Week is the cleansing of the temple. We heard this just a couple of weeks ago. Was it 2 weeks ago in the gospel? Right? But we read John's version. Right? We didn't read Mark's version. I put Mark's version in here because it has that one line that I bolded for you. It's number 10 on your sheet. They came to Jerusalem, and on entering the temple, he began to drive out those selling and buying there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. He did not permit anyone to carry anything through the temple area. He taught them, saying, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all people? I should have underlined for all people, but you have made it a den of thieves." Okay. Why did Jesus do this? What is this about? There's a lot actually happening here. First of all, where did this happen? On your sheet there, you have a picture of, somebody's idea, pretty common picture actually, of what that second temple, Herod's temple as it's called, looked like in Jerusalem. You see it had an inner court, right? That inner court could only be entered by Jews. And then you see it had that huge outer court there. You see the court of the Gentiles there, how big that is comparatively? That court of the Gentiles, that big open area, is where the money changers and the people selling the animals would have set up their tables. Okay? What this was supposed to be there were Gentiles. A Gentile is somebody who's not a Jew. There were Gentiles back then who believed that the God of Israel was the true God. They too would come to the temple to pray during these holy seasons, like, for example, at Passover. But they weren't allowed to go into the inner court. They had to stay within the court of the Gentiles. But that's where in John's gospel, the one we heard, here we heard, you have made it a den of thieves. In John's gospel, Jesus says, you have made it, in the Greek it says emporia, an emporium. Like a flea market, a bazaar. You ever go to the downtown Gainesville Festival? Is it a place that's conducive to prayer? Not really, right? I mean, it's hard. That's why people ask people to be quiet in church. It's supposed to be a house of prayer. So Jesus is saying, this you can't pray here. These Gentiles can't pray here because this is a circus atmosphere. It's not. There's more to this. It's not so much what they were doing, but where they were doing it that got him upset. All these people were serving a valid purpose. You had to offer a sacrifice when you of the Passover, depending on your means, be it a lamb or sheep or pigeons or something like that, right? A cow, an ox, and it had to be an unblemished animal. Yeah, you could have brought one from wherever you were traveling, but we know even today, traveling with animals is not easy, right? It's a bit of a pain. And if the animal were injured in any way on the journey, forget it. They couldn't be used. They had to be an unblemished. So what would the sensible thing to be? To buy the animal right there. There's nothing wrong with what they're doing. You had to offer a sacrifice. You had to get the animal somewhere. We'll see. That's where Peter and John got the lamb for the Passover, probably from that temple area. But it's where they were doing it. The same thing with the money changers. Rome was the occupying force there, right? When Jesus asked for a coin, he said, whose image is on this coin? And everybody said, Caesar, right? The Jews considered that to be blasphemous because Caesar considered himself a god. So you had to pay a temple tax, but you couldn't pay a temple tax with Roman money with a picture of a Roman god on it. So you had to exchange your money for temple money. So again, they were serving a valid purpose there. They were giving the money exchanges and so forth. So it's not what they were doing, it's where they were doing it. But yet there's even more to this that we heard last week in the gospel. But again, these things, Diane and Carol and so forth, and Mike Carroll, everybody, if you've been coming, we talked about this a bit last week. In John's Gospel, you know, one of the things that you hear often is Jesus saying, my time has not yet come, right? When Mary asks Jesus to turn the water into wine, what does he say? My time has not yet come. Actually, he says, my hour has not yet come, right, is the actual phrase. My hour has not yet come. What hour is he? He's talking about the hour, what we call the hour of glory, the moment of glory, when he's glorified on the cross. That's what he's referring to. He's referring to his crucifixion of this hour of glory. If you were listening to last Sunday's gospel, what did you hear? You heard that Greeks, Gentiles, came to Philip and Andrew saying they wanted to meet Jesus. Okay? Now, Jesus came from up north in Galilee. There was a big Greek influence. Again, all his disciples were Jews. Andrew was the brother of Peter, and Philip was they were Jews. Philip was a Jew. But Andrew and Philip are not Hebrew names. They are Greek names, distinctively Greek names. Andreas and Philippi, right? So what happened? Greeks sought out probably somebody who would speak their language, their own, right? They were Greeks, Gentiles. They saw Philip and Andrew, Greek people. Let's go to our own people, his disciples, with the Greek names, and ask them, can you bring us to Jesus? The prophets foretold over and over in many places. I think for whatever reason, it's in Zechariah, it's in Isaiah, it's in Micah, that one of the signs that the Messiah had come would be that Gentiles would be flowing into Jerusalem to find him, to come to seek after him. In Isaiah, I believe, and I forgot the exact passage of Isaiah, it says that the Greeks will see a Jew and they'll grab onto his coat and say, lead us to your God. Last Sunday, when Andrew and Philip told Jesus that there are these Greeks that came looking for you, what does Jesus say? My hour has come. From all these, it was 11 chapters, I think, of saying, my hour has not yet come, my hour has not yet come. The moment the Greeks look for him, he says, now. Now the hour has come, the time of the passion. Okay? And so here, where these,
You do have water.
yes, thank you, though, thank you. So you can tell my voice, that's why so here, these Gentiles, just as the prophets foretold, are coming to see the true temple of Jesus, and they can't even pray because the temple is filled with people selling animals and trinkets and money changers and Lord knows what else. So Jesus overturns these to get these people out of here. But the real key here, and there was even a little bit more, that I put in Mark's version of this story, and not the one we heard 2 weeks ago from John, when Jesus says, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. He's quoting the prophet Isaiah. You have it as number 11 on your sheet. I won't read the whole thing. I'll just explain what that means. And you could, we'll read the first paragraph of it there. The foreigner joined to the Lord should not say, the Lord will surely excuse me from his people, nor should they say to the eunuch, see, I am a dry tree. Okay. Yeah, that's why, you know, even the Jews don't understand this. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that later, what kind of explanation they have to go for here. To be a priest, a temple priest in Israel, you had to be a man. You had to be a man from the tribe of Levi, and you had to have a son, because they were concerned about the continuation of the priesthood, right? That came to an end with who? With John the Baptist. His father was who? Zechariah the priest. But John the Baptist didn't go on to become a priest of the Old Testament, right? So that's where that Old Testament priesthood lineage was, where that Old Testament was broken. what Isaiah, and so it was very restricted, right? Isaiah is saying, though, that the day is coming, the day of the Lord is coming, where not only will Gentiles be allowed in that inner court, not only will eunuchs be allowed, eunuchs were, even if you were a Jewish man, if you couldn't have a child, you weren't allowed in there. Right? The day will come when not only will even eunuchs be allowed in there, but the day will come when even the Gentiles and the eunuchs will be allowed to be priests. And Jews would be saying, oh, you got to be kidding me. You know, this can't possibly be. Yet that's what Isaiah is saying. And that's what Jesus is responding to when he's saying, my hour has come. Here they all come. And now they can't even pray because of all this nonsense going on in this court of the Gentiles. That's what number 12 on your sheet there, when Jesus said in Matthew's gospel about eunuchs, some are incapable of marriage because they were born so, some because they were made so by others, some because they have renounced marriage for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Whoever can accept this ought to accept it. Can you think of a situation today where a non-Jewish man without a son can be a priest? Do we have that today? Oh yeah, we do. We have one right in our parish here, right? You see how far back the roots of priestly celibacy go? That's why this is such a serious topic. Some say, well, look at the Orthodox. They have married priests. Why can't we? Well, because, this is a big deal here. This is something you better think long and hard about before you make any changes. So, Jesus is aware of all this, and the people, the money changers, the animal sales people and so forth, it's not so much what they're doing, but they're preventing the fulfillment of what Isaiah had said in the temple, in the house of the Lord where Jesus was. So he throws them out of there. These are the two things in Mark's gospel, the cursing of the fig tree and the cleansing of the temple, that he does on Holy Monday and Holy Tuesday. Okay? Let's move on to Wednesday, since time is moving on here. On Holy Wednesday, I have for you there, it's from Matthew, number 13. Has anybody ever heard of the term, you don't really hear it, Spy Wednesday? Has anybody heard Spy Wednesday? Anybody? I don't think it's a Catholic thing. I think it's more of a Protestant thing. Wednesday of Holy Week is called Spy Wednesday. Because why? Well, let's read that. Jesus said to his disciples, this is number 13 there, right? You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming. Okay, so the Passover is coming sundown on Friday. That means what? This must be Holy Wednesday that we're talking about here. Okay, so we have to kind of figure that out. And the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. And then it goes on for a while and continues. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, who was Caiaphas, and took counsel together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth to kill him. That's why it's called Spy Tuesday by some people, because they were seeking to arrest Jesus in a sneaky kind of way. Where was I? But they said, no, not during the feast, lest there be a tumult among the people. Remember, they just welcomed Jesus as king into Jerusalem. They go and arrest him. They're afraid there's going to be a riot. So they have to do this on the sneak somehow. So how are they going to do it? Well, one of the 12, who was called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, what will you give me if I deliver him to you? And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray him. You hear a lot today, especially if you watch some of these crazy TV channels that I watch, the History Channel and American Heroes, True Mysteries of the Bible and so forth. You see all this nonsense about, Judas really played a very important role in the history of... Judas betrayed Jesus for one and only one reason. Money. Judas stole from the poor box. Right? John saw him do it. You have it there, number 14, in John chapter 12, how Judas used to take money out of there. So Judas was greedy. That's why he sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Why 30 pieces of silver? From the book of Exodus. That was the price of a slave. You see from Exodus? But if it's a male or a female slave in divorce, he must pay the owner of the slave 30 shekels of silver, and the ox must be stoned. That was, he sold out Jesus for the price of a slave. You know of anybody else who was sold for, well, in this case, 20 pieces of silver in the Old Testament? Huh? Joseph. Remember the story of Joseph? Joseph was one of the sons of Jacob, right? One of the 12. Jacob had 12 sons and one daughter, and these were the ones who would be the patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel. Right? And we have it goes on for many chapters in the Bible. So I gave you one Genesis chapter 37, but it goes on for chapter after chapter. It tells us he was a good man, a righteous man. He was handsome, he was strong, he was the apple of his father's eye. Jacob absolutely loved his son Joseph. So much so, Joseph was given in dreams. God spoke to him, telling him, I have great things in mind for you. You're going to become great. Okay? And he would share these. And so his brothers got exceedingly jealous over Joseph. And so they decided, I know what we could do. We'll kill him. So they took him out to kill him. But then one of them said, wait a minute, why should we kill him? They saw Ishmaelites caravan. Ishmaelites would be where the future Muslims would come from. They saw a caravan of Ishmaelites, and they said, let's sell him as a slave to the Ishmaelites. We can get rid of him that way and make some money on the deal. Okay? So that's what they did. They took his coat. If you're my age, when you were in high school, did you have Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat by Andrew Lloyd Webber and Finn Rice? I had that record when I was that. His father loved him so much, he gave him this fancy coat. But what actually was 10 of the brothers. Benjamin stayed with his father, didn't want to be alone, and the 11 of them went off, and they threw Joseph into a pit. They took his fancy multi-technicolor coat, and they killed a goat, and they put blood on the coat, and they gave it back to his father, saying, look what happened to Joseph. And poor Jacob was saying, no, my poor son was killed by a wild animal and so forth. In the meantime, he was sold into slavery, and things were not going well for him. He had a master in Egypt. He was brought into slavery into Egypt. He had a master. He was a very handsome man. And when the master was away one day, the master's wife asked him to sleep with him and said, no, that's a sin before the Lord. I can't do that. But she kept after him, and he kept saying no. Then one day, she got a servant, and she just kind of went after him. She said, we're going to sleep together, and ripped his coat off, and he ran away. And that's when she said, a Hebrew in my house, Somehow, how would she know that? When the cloak got ripped off, it's a Jew, So when her master got, the sign of the covenant, when the master got home, she said, your Jew servant tried to attack me. Of course he didn't, but that got Joseph thrown into jail. I'm trying to give you the shortest possible version of what goes on in all of these chapters. In the meantime, the Pharaoh had a couple of servants that he was unpleased with, and he didn't like the work they did, so he threw them in jail. Kind of like working for Donald Trump, I guess, right? Make one mistake and you're out, right? So and that's where they met Joseph and found he had the gift for interpreting dreams. Well, when one of the Pharaoh's servants was released from jail, went back to the Pharaoh was having dreams, and none of his wise men could interpret the dreams for him. But the servant said, hey, I met this Jewish guy in prison, and he's good at interpreting dreams. As a matter of fact, he told us it's not him who interprets them. The Lord God tells him what the dreams mean. So Pharaoh said, bring him here, and they did. They cleaned him up. They brought him to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh told the dream. And basically the upshot, what Joseph interpreted for the dream was that what Pharaoh's dream was about is that there were going to be 7 years of great wealth and rich crops, and it was going to be a bumper crop year. It's going to, for 7 years, it's going to be just super abundance, but it's going to be followed with 7 years of absolute horrible famine, that worse than the world had ever seen. And that's exactly what happened. And Pharaoh was so impressed that Joseph had this figure. And so what Joseph told Pharaoh to do, he goes, in these 7 years, you got to store. You got to prepare for this horrible famine that's coming. He told him, you got to store wheat specifically. Isn't that interesting? You got to store wheat so that you could be prepared to save your people with this wheat when the famine comes. Isn't that interesting, you know? So that's exactly what happened, and Pharaoh was so impressed with Joseph that he made him his right-hand man. You know, he was given the second highest position after Pharaoh in all of Egypt. And the famine was raging. Joseph's brothers had to leave their homeland in search of food, and they went into Egypt foraging for food because they heard that Egypt had food. And the long and the short of it is that, you know, that goes on for a couple more chapters, but you would think that when they finally realized it was Joseph who they were brought to as the Pharaoh's right-hand man, they would have said, oh no, we're in trouble now. But no, that's not what happened. I mean, Joseph he said, this was all part of God's plan, that you sold me into slavery and so forth. And as they would say in New York, everything ended real huggy kissing. Okay, but again, who does that sound like? Somebody who was betrayed by his own brothers and left for dead, sold into slavery, who emerges from the ashes and then as a result is able to save the world from starvation. It's a Christ-like figure. Okay, so. By the way, guess the name of the brother whose idea it was to sell Joseph into slavery. It was Judah, right? And Judah and Judas are exactly the same name. It's like the difference between John and Johnny or something like that. Or you know, John with an H or John without an H. It's the same name. Interesting that it was Judah or Judas that sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver, and it was Judas who sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. I do not know why that difference, 20, 30. I guess the 20 was pre-Mosaic, so inflation maybe. I don't know what else to think, but something along those lines. That's why, by the way, that we tend to forget this now, because for Catholics, Fridays are traditionally days of penance. But there was a time when Wednesdays were also a day of penance. We don't do that anymore. The Code of Canon Law says that Fridays are a day of penance. Yeah?
Wednesday's child is full of woe.
Yeah. Well, the reason is because, you know, Friday, obviously Christ died on Friday, but Wednesday because Judas, in a certain sense, sold Jesus out on Wednesday. And that made that made Wednesday a day of penance as well. Let's move on to Holy Thursday. We'll try to be quick about Holy Thursday to a certain degree, because I think you know a lot of it already. Protestants call it Maundy Thursday, right? You heard of Maundy Thursday? And where do they get that from? They got that from us. You know, from the what we would call today the entrance antiphon. Back in the Old Mass would have been called the introit, in Latin, mandatum novum da vobis, a new commandment I give you. Somehow from that first word, mandatum, commandment, they extracted Maundy and it became Maundy Thursday. But that's the entrance antiphon for Holy Thursday. A new commandment I give you, mandatum novum da vobis, love one another as I have loved you. Okay, we won't go into of all the things that we could look at for Holy Thursday, or that it's the washing of the feet that takes the, and you know, Jesus, the suffering servant of Isaiah, the washing of the feet is the job of the servant, not just the servant, but the lowest servant. The more important thing, I think, from our perspective, I think most of us are aware of the humble service of foot washing, okay? What I think we'll look at instead is that's when the preparation of the lambs begin. Okay, and what does Jesus do? We'll look at Luke's version of it. Jesus sends Peter and John to prepare the Passover. Remember, Jesus can't go to prepare it because Jesus is a wanted man. There's a price on his head, 30 pieces of silver. So the Lamb of God has to be on the lamb here. How about something like that, right? So he has to stay hidden. So he sends Peter and John to prepare the Passover. That's in Luke on number 17 on your sheet. Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. So Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat it." They said to him, "Where will you have us prepare it?" He said to them, "Behold, when you have entered the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him into the house which he enters, and tell the householder, the teacher says to you, where is the guest room where I am to eat the Passover with my disciples? And he will show you a large upper room furnished. There make ready." And they went and found it as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. We'll get into in a minute here whose house this may have been. We have some knowledge about that. What?
Joseph of Arimathea.
We'll get to that. It's actually, no, you'll see. We're not really sure whose house it is the bottom line answer. But there's some very, very recent scholarship that's fascinating, that scholars are shedding some new light on where this may have been. First, remember, today, a Passover, a Seder, is just a meal. You go eat, okay? That wasn't what it was like at the time of Jesus. It was also a sacrifice, okay? Does that sound like something? It's a meal and a sacrifice? What else is a meal and a sacrifice? A memorial meal and a sacrifice? A mass, yeah, man. So Peter and John, to prepare the Passover, what did that mean? They had to procure a lamb. They probably did that at the temple. I don't know. My guess is that these money changers and people went back into the temple afterwards. So they probably went there and they bought a lamb. They had to have it sacrificed by the priests, and then they had to prepare it. They had to gut it, skin it, and put it on a spit, ready for roasting. A couple of interesting things about that. Remember I told you that the Passover was a pilgrimage feast. If you were a Jew, you had to travel to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, period, end of story. The Roman historian, the Jewish historian Josephus, I don't know if you're familiar with Josephus. If you want to see, it's a wealth. He was a Jewish historian that fought the Romans in that war that eventually had the temple overthrown. He was a general in the Jewish army. He was very well-to-do, so he kind of survived things. But he was also a scholar, the book by Josephus, which you could find in almost any Christian bookstore, gives a wealth of knowledge about what life was like in the first century, the time of Jesus. That's the time he wrote for. He tells us that, remember in Exodus, it says that not each family doesn't have to have a lamb. If you're a small family, you could get in with another family and share a lamb. He points out that there were about over 1 million people in Jerusalem. That's a lot of people back then for a city like that. There were over 1 million people in Jerusalem for that pilgrimage feast, and it represented over 250,000 lambs that were. So you had to have a very systematic way of sacrificing these lambs. And what they did was a bucket brigade. Basically, you stood in line, with your animal, and when your turn came, you laid it on the altar. A priest would slit the throat. The blood would come gushing out. His companion priest would catch it in either a gold or a silver basin or bowl, and then he would pass it to another priest who would pass it, and the last priest would splash it at the foot of the altar, and this process would just continue like this, because that's a lot of, in one day to have to slaughter in that one city over 250,000 lambs. Here's what Josephus said. Josephus. So these high priests, upon the coming of their feast, which is called the Passover, when they slay their sacrifices from the 9th hour to the 11th, found the number of sacrifices was, he has a look at this number, 256,500 sheep. Okay? And so the other source of phenomenal information for the Jews is called the Mishnah. I don't know if you're familiar with the Mishnah. This remained oral for up until about the year AD 400, and then they started to write it down, and it's called the Oral Torah, because for Jews, this is more important than the Bible. This is more important than the Torah. Because just like we read from Exodus, you read some of these things and you say, huh? What? What did that say? What is this? This explained what the Bible was telling them to do, and it gave them the procedures for doing it. So it contained everything the Bible said in it, but it also had the practical guidelines about how you're supposed to go about and do it, the rules, the regulations, and so forth. This is one of the most valuable books that a Jew would study, would learn about his faith from. Anyway, I put a piece in there from this. This is the Danby translation of the Mishnah. Listen to this. The Passover offering was slaughtered in 3 groups. When the first group entered the temple court, was filled, the gates of the temple court were closed. This almost sounds like a ride at Disney, doesn't it? The people all go in and then somebody's counting and then they close the gates and you got to wait for them to come out the other end. Exactly like a Disney operation. Maybe that's where Disney got the idea from. I don't know. Was Walt Disney a Jew? I don't think so. But you never know what he knew. The priests stood in rows, and in their hands were basins of silver and basins of gold. In one row, all the basins were of silver, and in another row, all the basins were of gold. An Israelite slaughtered his offering, and the priest caught the blood. The priest passed the basin to his fellow, and he to his fellow, each receiving a full basin and giving back an empty one. The priest nearest the altar tossed the blood in one action against the base. When the first group went out, the second group came in. And when the second group went out, the third group went in. In the meantime, the Levites sang the Hallel, that praise psalm, Psalm 116 through 118. If they finished it, they sang it again. Sort of like the Lamb of God. If the breaking of the bread is not finished, you keep singing the Lamb of God. Justin Martyr, who was Saint Justin Martyr, one of the early fathers of the church, talked about how the lambs were prepared. He said, and you have it, I didn't put a number there, but it's the thing after we just read. For the lamb which is roasted and dressed up in the form of a cross. For one spit is transfixed right through the lower part up into the head, and one across the back, to which are attached the legs of the lamb. So, Justin Martyr was saying that after you got your lamb slaughtered, what you had to do now is you had to go outside and gut it. What happens if you don't gut it right away? You got to gut it, right? Suzanne, you can't wait, right? You do this all the time, it sounds like, from what people...
So do we want to come out?
Once the animal is dead, you can't let those innards stay, right? You got to prepare it. So you got to skin it, gut it, get the guts out. And Justin Martyr is saying that it's in the form of a cross that the animal is put on the spit. Now, there were, some, even me too. When I read something like this from the early centuries, they say, is that, I wonder if that's really true or if that's a little bit fanciful thinking. There was a Jewish scholar asked that same question. His name I forgot his name here. But he published this is a Jew, The Crucifixion of the Paschal Lamb by Joseph Tabori. He's from Bar Ilan University, which is in Israel. He researched this academically, and sure enough, he found, because he said the same thing, now these Christians just making this up to make it sound, and he said, no, this is really what happened. This is really what they did. If you want to see the paper, you can come see the paper. He found out something else that was very interesting about the crown of thorns, sort of. Apparently, in his research to find out how, during that time of Jesus, did Jews really prepare the lamb, and he found out what St. Justin Martyr said was absolutely true. It was put on a spit in the form of a cross. There was also something interesting that happened in that its guts, its entrails, were not, he doesn't quite elaborate why, but he said he found that those entrails were taken and wrapped around the lamb's head. Okay? And it was seen as a helmet or a crown upon the crown. Maybe just we get crown of lamb from, I don't know.
was seen as a crown that was put upon the lamb, and it was roasted that way. And he said, well, not only did I find out what St. Justin Martyr said was true, but if you read the Bible, they took the royal robe off Jesus before they crucified him, but there was nothing about them taking off the crown of thorns. And all the images we see of Jesus on the cross, he's wearing a crown of thorns. And the Passover lamb is also wearing a crown, in this case of his image. So just I thought interesting. Okay. Also, Linda was asking about all this blood. Where did all this blood go? Well, the temple had running water, because first of all, the Romans were great engineers. The Romans were able to build viaducts that exist to this very day. So good, right? They were fantastic builders. And the temple had water. The water came from mountain streams that be channeled viaducts into the temple, and then you can turn it on or off. It just drained. And so as these lambs were being sacrificed, and the blood was the floors didn't have grout. The tiles had cracks, and the blood would drain, and they would allow it to be mixed with, because blood would coagulate, get sticky and everything. Things didn't smell good back then at all. Why do you think incense got popular? You got to do something to cover up all that stench. But that was life back then. You didn't think it. Today we say, ooh, back then it was the way it was. So you had to let the water mingle with the blood. And again, from the Mishnah, look what the Mishnah says. At the southwest corner of the altar were two holes like two narrow nostrils, by which the blood that was poured over the western base and the southern base used to run down and mingle in the water channel and flow out into the brook Kidron. Okay? A common sight for centuries, for millennia, as long as the Passover was celebrated in Jerusalem, a common sight during the preparation of the lambs was blood and water coming from the side of the temple. Think about that. When Jesus went with his parents at age 12 to the temple, he would have seen that. He would have seen the lambs carried on spits in the form of a cross. He would have seen the blood and water issuing from the side of the temple. Imagine a first century Jew who heard Jesus' words about destroy this temple and in 3 days I will restore it. And then he heard from John's gospel, and it's only in John's gospel, that they didn't break his legs, because the book of Exodus says you can't break the legs of the Passover lamb. You're not allowed to do that. They didn't break his legs either. But they took a lance and they stuck it in his side, and blood and water. How about that? And then he thinks what Jesus said about himself being the true temple. Amazing, amazing connections here. And then it's the Passover meal itself. I put Matthew's version in here for us, number 21 on your sheet. Just quickly, now as they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed it and broke it, and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." He took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink of it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which was poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." The blood of the new covenant for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I shall not drink again of this fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. All right. Where do I even start here? First, this was a Passover meal. One of the highlights of the Passover meal is the retelling of the story from Exodus, right? How God delivered people from the hands of the slavery in Egypt and beginning their journey into the Promised Land. There's none of that here. There's nothing about them eating the flesh of any kind of lamb. Remember, for the Passover, it wasn't just enough to say, no, I'm a vegetarian. You couldn't be a vegetarian if you were a Jew. I don't know, Diane, what with you when you were young, what did you do? You must have ate meat back then, right? You had to eat. If you were at the first Passover and you didn't eat the flesh of that Passover lamb, when the angel of death passed over, if you were the firstborn, you were gone. Or your firstborn would have been gone. Well, that's, yeah.
It was the lamb. Yeah.
The rest of the lamb.
You had to, it's spelled out in Exodus that you had to eat the flesh of the lamb. Yet, there's nothing about them eating the flesh of the lamb. Instead, Jesus distributes the unleavened bread and associates his body with the unleavened bread. And remember, as I said earlier, the disciples were with Jesus for, they had a 3-year Bible study, 24/7 with Jesus. You know, they knew what the prophets had foretold. They knew what Jesus was teaching them. If you remember, I think it was last Sunday's reading was from the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah foretold the coming of the day when a new covenant would be established by the Messiah, which was different from all the old covenants, because the new covenant will be for the forgiveness of sins. Now, the disciples knew Jeremiah. Everybody knew Jeremiah. And here they hear Jesus saying, "This is the new covenant in my blood, which will be poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins." You know, I think now I understand better why you had to eat the Passover reclining on a pillow, not sitting on a chair. I think if you knew anything that you would have fallen out of a chair when you heard Jesus say these words. They would have known exactly what he was doing. What the prophets had foretold was being fulfilled right before their very eyes with the establishment of a new covenant for the forgiveness of sins. And then it says, Jesus sang a hymn and left. Imagine that. Jesus sang. Could you picture Jesus singing? Yeah. What did he sing? Chances are, 99.999% because they do. And 100%, he sang the second part of Psalm 116, the Hallel. What did Jesus sing?
The second half of Hallel is done after the meal. You begin, Lo lanu Adonai lo lanu, ki l'shimcha ten kavod. We daven through each psalm at a time, conclude at the end of each psalm, Yisrael betach b'Adonai, Ezram u'maginam hu, Beit Aharon bitchu v'Adonai, Ezram u'maginam hu, Yirei Adonai bitchu v'Adonai, Ezram u'maginam hu. The next psalm.
That's what Jesus sang. That's what Jews from back then, today, they sing the Hallel Psalms at the end of the Passover meal. Yeah?
If that was sung, is that in Hebrew, what we just listened to, or is it in?
Yeah.
So Jesus spoke both Hebrew, like he sung.
He would probably have sang an Aramaic version. Aramaic was a dialect of Hebrew. He probably would have had an Aramaic dialect. This is Hebrew. What did he say? What did those words mean? Number 22 on your page. And I highlighted some of them because here's what Jesus sang. What shall I render to the Lord for all his bounty to me? I will lift up the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. Remember, they sang, the Passover is 4 cups. They had 3 cups, and Jesus abruptly ended the Passover, and they went out to the Garden of Gethsemane. So Jesus had just finished consecrating that 3rd cup, calling it the new covenant in his blood for the forgiveness of sins. And he's singing, I will lift the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. I will pay my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. O Lord, I am thy servant. I am thy servant, the son of thy handmaid. Thou hast loosed my bonds. I will offer thee the sacrifice of thanksgiving. Jesus is singing, I am the son of thy handmaid. Who is the handmaid that he's the son of? Mary. Jesus is singing about Mary at the Last Supper. Next time any of you, the Protestant people, say to you, how come you Catholics sing about Mary all the time? Give them a simple answer. Because Jesus did.
He's thinking about his mother. So do we. He said, I will offer to thee the sacrifice of thanksgiving. In Hebrew, the sacrifice of thanksgiving, todah. In Greek, Eucharistia. Eucharist. Right? That's holy. And then, after he sings the song, they head out to the garden. Jesus brings with him to the garden. Who does he bring with him? He brings Peter, James, and John to the Mount of Olives. The Mountain of Olives. Har is in Hebrew, mountain of Olives. The same three, Peter, James, and John, they were part of the inner circle, yes, and they were the same three that he brought to the Mount of the Transfiguration, which we normally associate with Mount Tabor. Okay? It said he brought Peter, James, and John to the Mount of the Transfiguration. So, we say Jesus was transfigured. He wasn't transfigured. Peter, James, and John were allowed to see him as he really is. He did that to give them the strength and the encouragement so they would be able to endure what they were about to see when Jesus ascends that mountain called Calvary. Maybe they wouldn't have been able to handle it. So to give them the strength that he is who he says he is, he brings them to the mountain of transfiguration, and now he brings those same three to the mountain of olives. So to see that parallel between the Mount of the Transfiguration and the Mount of Olives in the Garden of Gethsemane. The other thing, too, is people say all the time that when Jesus prayed, he called God Abba. Wasn't that nice? He always referred to his Father, God, as Abba. Keep two things in mind. One, maybe he did, I don't know. But in all Gospels, in all four of the Gospels, there is one and only one place where Jesus specifically calls God Father, and that's right here in Mark's Gospel. This is the only place he does it once. And what does Abba mean?
Daddy.
Daddy.
Daddy is what we use, it's not daddy.
No?
Abba is simply the Aramaic word for father. Nothing more. Nothing more. Hebrew would be Av, right? The bet would have the dagesh, so it would have the V sound. In Hebrew, father is Av. In Aramaic, it's Abba. Right? And don't take my word for it. I brought, this is written by James Barr, published in the Oxford Journal of Theological Studies. And the title of his paper, this is a reviewed scholarly journal, you just can't write it. Abba isn't daddy. And so, sorry, but you want to know the right thing, right? You don't want to, as nice as it might be to think of that, you got to know the right thing, okay? So maybe he did call him daddy more, I don't know, but not according to the Gospels, we can't say that. Also, why are we given this information about the Mount of Olives? What's so important? Why do we need to know that it was the Mount of Olives that he went? Why didn't he just go to some garden and pray? I haven't been to the Holy Land. I'd love to go one day. But they say that to this day, the place is just in olive trees on this Mount of Olives, just centuries-old olive trees. Some of them, they say, go back. I don't know if it's true or not. I don't know how long an olive tree lives. But they say some of them could go back to the time of Jesus, So they bring out the point that he went to the Mount of Olives. They had to tell you that. And specifically to the Garden of Gethsemane. What does Gethsemane mean? That's a word. What does the word mean? You know what Gethsemane means? It means oil press. It's where the olives would be put to extract the oil from them. We talked a little while ago, about the ancient Jewish tradition of the fig tree being the tree of death. In that same Jewish tradition, guess which tree is seen as the tree of life? The olive tree. You see these merchants, they go around to churches, they're selling gifts from the holy. You get a crucifix made from the holy. What's it always made out of? It's made out of olive wood. In, again, the ancient Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, it says in some of those apocryphal writings, again, not in the Bible, but this is what Jews believe today, even Orthodox Jews, and certainly during the time of Jesus, that one day, the day will come, it's written in these places, that the day will come when God will have mercy on fallen Adam and Eve and bring them to the tree of mercy from which flows the oil of life. There's another kind of legend part of that story. When Adam was old and aging, kicked out of the garden, and like me, his joints were aching with arthritis and whatnot. Today, what do men do? They said to their wife, honey, please go get me another beer. Well, what Adam said to Eve was, please go to the tree of life and bring me the oil so that I might be anointed. From ancient times, including the time of Jesus, the tree of mercy from which flows the oil of life is the olive tree. Jews saw the fig tree as the fig tree of death, the olive tree as the tree of life. And again, remember, Jesus is the new Adam. Jesus will now bring the tree of life, the cross, right? From which will flow the ointment of mercy and healing for all. Any other question?
I was just gonna ask, the chrism oil that they're doing this Wednesday, all of those are olive?
All olive oil. It's all olive oil. That's why we make such a big deal out of this chrism mass, right? Wednesday, the bishop will consecrate the oil that's going to be used for all the churches in this diocese, the three oils, the oil of the sick, the oil of the catechumens, and the sacred chrism, all of which are olive oil. The sacred chrism has some perfume put in it that's used for baptisms and confirmations and ordinations and consecrating new altars, consecrating churches, and so forth. The chrism mass, because the oil is the symbol of the tree, what flows from the tree of mercy. Yeah. So that's what's happening. And Jesus in this, we heard today in the gospel, the long one that we had to sit through. Jesus goes to the garden and he brings Peter, James, and John, and he says, keep vigil. This is not an uncommon thing to ask them. And of course, now, if you've had 4 glasses of wine for most Passovers, it's hard to, but it was a common practice today even, to keep vigil after the Passover, to stay awake and pray. And having 4 glasses of wine makes it even harder to stay awake and pray. So the apostles couldn't do it. They had their 3 glasses of wine and they fell asleep. But this was a common practice. Just as we fast from food and so forth during Lent, Jews would also fast. When fasting, they would fast from food. They would also fast from sleep. Okay? So Jesus asked them to keep vigil, but it doesn't work. They can't do it. And so that's what happened there. Now, when Jesus gets arrested, what happens next in the garden there is Judas with the soldiers. They figure Jesus wasn't in the upper room. Okay, let's go check and see where he is. Maybe in the Garden of Gethsemane. And sure enough, that's where they find him and they arrest him. I want to bring your attention to one line. Tell me if you heard this. It was read today. It's Mark 14. And they said they all left him and fled, referring to the apostles. Now a young man followed him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth around his body. They seized him, but he left the cloth behind and ran off naked. Who is this guy?
Mark?
Who is it?
Luke or Mark?
We talked about it, I think, in the class, right? A couple months ago. Well, the bottom line is we don't know who it is. It's puzzled, but it's puzzled scholars for centuries as to who this is. St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine both claim that it's the Apostle John. The reason they say that is because John was young, and it says a young man. Okay, so they conclude it's the Apostle John. That doesn't make sense, though, because it says in the line before, they all left him and fled. To me, all means all. So if they all left him, that means it couldn't be John. Then there were some, I think it was St. Ambrose, is that it was James, the person that's identified as the brother of Jesus. Not brother, but he's called in the Gospels the brother of Jesus. And the reason some people have proposed this was because James went on to be the first bishop of Jerusalem, and he was known to be an ascetic. He lived a very simple, austere life. And they said, aha, well, whoever this is, he only wore a basic shirt, tunic, so it must have been James. That's not very strong evidence either. There's a third option, the one that a couple of you have said, has in recent years been getting a good deal of traction. And that is that this person is none other than Mark himself, the author of this gospel. The first person to propose that was a person called Victor of Antioch. He was a contemporary of St. John Chrysostom, so that puts him at around the year 400 and so forth. And the reason he proposed it, and the reason people that are, within the last 3 or 4 years, people started to revisit this. Still this people wonder, who is this mysterious man? Well, when Judas went with the soldiers to get Jesus, they said probably the first place they went is to the upper room, right, where Judas left. He said, okay, I just left him, he's in the upper room, let's go get him. They go there, and Jesus is not there. It's like modern police shows you watch on this investigative discovery channels and so forth. Cops looking for somebody, they go to the last place the person was known to be, okay? And so then Judas says, I know, they probably went out to the garden to pray, let's go to the, let's go to that garden, and sure enough, that's where they find him. The context is that this young man, whoever he is, lived in the house where the upper room where that Last Supper was celebrated. He was in that house sleeping. You see, it would have been late, but the commotion of Judas and the soldiers coming to get Jesus would have awoken him. And when they left, out of curiosity, he followed to see what was going on. Kind of makes sense. Have you ever, late at night, a noise wakes you up, and then so you open your eyes and you kind of see lights flashing, so you go look out your front window or something, maybe just have your night clothes on, right? And maybe there's an ambulance or something at your neighbor's house, you kind of check it out, and maybe you go outside to see what was going on, That happened when my mother was taken to the hospital when she died, late, there was an ambulance, and the neighbors started to come out, what's going on? Well, it said that he followed Judas and the soldiers to the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus was arrested. And at that point, the disciples fled. The soldiers would have grabbed whoever was left. They tried to grab him, but he just, shook off his garment and ran away naked. How did they ever come up with this crazy theory? In the book of the Acts of the Apostles, actually chapter 12 of the book of the Apostles, it tells us that Mark, his real name was John Mark, right? He was a resident of Jerusalem, and that his mother's name was known. It was Mary of Jerusalem, was her name, and she was a good and a close friend of the Apostle Peter. In Acts of the Apostles, we read that when Peter escaped from prison, the first place he went was to the house of Mary of Jerusalem, who happened to be the mother of John Mark. Now, although Mark himself was a disciple of Jesus, they suggest that he was Mary's son, close friend of Peter, celebrated the Last Supper. She provided the upper room where that happened. And they're saying this is not uncommon in ancient writings, that Mark is playing sort of a cameo role here. Ancient writers would sometimes do that. They would just make his briefest of brief appearances into their biography or whatever they were writing, so that you knew. You remember the old Alfred Hitchcock movies? He used to do that. Remember that? He would always make like a 10-second, even 5-second appearance as a cameo appearance. He'd walk in and just walk, or he'd walk by, just so you know that this was an Alfred Hitchcock. It's not the most important question in the universe, of course, but it's a question you get a lot when people, we're not tired of standing during the reading of this gospel, listen carefully and say, who was that guy? You're free to believe whatever you want. The church has no official teaching on who this guy was, so you're free to believe whatever you want. Okay. The sad fact, though, that's being portrayed here is that everybody fled. They left Jesus totally alone. He was on his own. Okay. Let's get to the trial. First, on Thursday night, he's tried by the high priest. Right? They want to put him to death. The book of the book of Deuteronomy, I think, it's on your sheet. I think it's number 24 on your sheet. Makes it clear that to put somebody to death, you need at least 2 witnesses. You can't put someone to death with the testimony of 1 witness. But what does it come down to? The high priest Caiaphas asked Jesus, just tell us, are you the Son of God? And Jesus says, I am, and you will see the Son of Man ascending on the throne among the clouds of heaven. And that's when Caiaphas says, you all heard what he said. What need do we have of witnesses? All these witnesses. You heard him. Any Jew would know that there's only one person that sits on a throne on the clouds of heaven, and that's God. So Jesus clearly has made a divine claim here, and to them they say that that's good enough to put him to death. Okay, blasphemy. So what I think the irony here that often gets missed, okay, the charge against Jesus that puts him, that he's been sentenced to death is what? The charge is what? Blasphemy, right? He's charged with blasphemy. And who utters this blasphemy? Caiaphas. Who charges him with this blasphemy? Caiaphas. Right? Now you've heard what he said. He claimed to be the Son of God. If you were to take the Bible, here's the Bible. If you were to take this Bible and start with Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, read all the way through the book of Revelation to chapter 22, verse 21, and search for the greatest blasphemy ever spoken, you know what it is? You know what that greatest blasphemy is? It's John chapter 19, verse 15. We have no king but Caesar. You heard it today. Who said that? Caiaphas. The man who charged Jesus with blasphemy is the person who comes up with the blasphemy of blasphemies in this whole Bible. So, okay, they can't put Jesus to death, though. They decide, yep, good enough, he claimed to be God, he's subject to death. But, Jews couldn't put anybody to death. They weren't really in charge. The Romans were in charge. So now we're into Friday morning of Holy Week, and Jesus is before Pilate. You may have noticed today that Pilate's questioning takes a whole different line. 4 times, if you count it, 4 times, Pilate asks Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? Because what does Pilate care if somebody claims to be the Messiah? There's nothing wrong with that. There are plenty of people who claim to be the Messiah. King Herod thought of himself as the Messiah. Lots of people thought they were the Messiah. There's nothing, let them think that. Let them think they're Napoleon or something. But to say you're the king of the Jews, now that's, now you're challenging Caesar, right? That's sedition. That would be the charge that Pilate would have to use to stick Jesus to death, would be the king of the Jews. And so that's the charge that he was actually executed on. And Pilate the 5th time puts on the head of the cross, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin for everybody to read. From that whole long thing that we heard today, Mark's version of the Passion, one verse that you heard, chapter 15, verse 15. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas to them, and after he had Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. The Gospels make very little of the scourging, and a lot of scholars wondered why They just kind of passed it, just that's so simple. You can't have them. We don't understand today what scourging means. Have you seen, I brought the hard copy book of the story of the Passion. You know, you've seen the movie The Passion, Mel Gibson, right? Yeah, Mel Gibson, The Passion. We went to see it when it came out in the movies. If you haven't seen it, you think twice before you want to watch it. It's not an easy movie to watch. We bought the DVD. It's still sitting at home in shrink wrap because Carol and I can't bring ourselves to watch that movie again. It is so gory. You know, some of the still pictures in here, I don't want you, if you want to come see, you get the idea. You know what? This has to begin to capture what scourging was all about. Scourging wasn't just whipping. We tend to think he was whipped or caned or something. They would tie little pieces of metal or bone or something like that to the end of leather straps so that when you were whipped, it would literally tear your flesh away. That was the idea. The idea was to lacerate the human body as much as possible so streams of blood would just be cut. After you were scourged, you wouldn't look even like necessarily a human being anymore. It would just be such a horror to look at. Crucifixion was always preceded by scourging because the Romans used it as a way of instilling fear into anyone else who would oppose them. You hear the same today with like the drug cartels, right? The drug lords that you hear from South America and so forth. If there's competition or somebody interfering with them, what's the easiest thing to do? Boom, shoot them, they're gone. That's not what they do. Purposely, that's not what they do. Usually the death is by knives. They skin their people, they skin their victims alive, give them the most brutal, horrible, ugly death to make them suffer, but also to send a very clear message. You could be next. You want to oppose us? Go ahead. This could be you. Josephus, number 26 on your sheet there. I should have put it before. A first century Jewish historian who fought the war against Rome as a general. Here's how he described scourging. The Romans had them scourged until their entrails were visible. The men were then dismissed, all covered in blood, a spectacle that struck such terror into their menacing foes that they dropped their arms and fled. That was scourging. Your guts were visible. Your skin was ripped off your body. Crucifixion is death by suffocation, right? That's not bad enough. But the sight, the image of this person with their skin ripped off dying on the cross is Rome's way of saying, you don't mess with us. Interesting, too, to remember that the Passover lamb had to be skinned right before it was roasted. The scourging ripped off the skin. We don't think of scourging. I don't think we think of scourging that way. This movie, of course, couldn't begin to capture it. It's as bloody as horrible. I couldn't watch it again. As horrible as it was, that's scourging. The worst that you could imagine. I think in interest of time here, I better stop. Let's skip. I was going to talk about Simon of Cyrene, but let's skip that. Let's skip that entirely. Let's start to get to the close of this thing. You want to go home. Let's look at Mark's timing of the crucifixion, because we heard that today too. Mark is a short gospel. Mark is about half as long only as Matthew. So when Mark emphasizes something, that's his way of saying to you, this is important. This is very important. Are you paying attention when he emphasizes something? Mark's gospel we heard today, number 31 on your sheet. It was 9 o'clock in the morning, that would be the third hour, when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, King of the Jews. This was the fifth time. At noon, which is the sixth hour, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon, the ninth hour. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me? Some of the bystanders who heard it said, look, he is calling on Elijah. One of them ran, soaked a sponge with wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, let's see if Elijah comes to take him down. Excuse me. Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. Okay. First, before we look at the timing, this thing about the sponge on the reed. Some of the old translations say they put the sponge on a reed of hyssop. Why hyssop? No, it's a herb. Think back to Exodus. In the first Passover, what did you have to do to have the angel of death pass over your house? Mark your door and how were you told to mark it? Hyssop. You had to take a sprig of hyssop, dip it in the blood of the lamb, and mark the size of your door and across the top. Notice you were making the sign of the cross on your door. Okay. What's happening here? They're not taking blood, they're taking wine, which Jesus just associated with his blood. And they're saying a reed in the modern translations because hyssop is like parsley, You're not going to lift anything on a sprig of parsley, right? It's just not going to hold a sponge. So, there's probably the symbolism going back to the book of Exodus, on the actual, the first Passover. So that's why they say a reed. A reed kind of makes more sense. So that's that business there. And the timing. Okay, Mark seems to go out of his way to tell us that the crucifixion begins at 9 a.m. That's the third hour. 0 is sunrise, usually taken at 6 a.m. So 9 a.m. would be the third hour, noon would be the 6th hour, 3 p.m. would be the ninth hour. And he tells us twice, in the short gospel, Mark tells us twice that Jesus dies on the 9th hour. Why this detail? Well, take a look at number 32 from the book of Exodus, on your sheet, number 32. According to the Old Testament, ancient Jewish tradition, this is in the Mishnah. This all comes out of the Mishnah. Ancient Jewish tradition says that 9 o'clock in the morning and 3 o'clock in the afternoon were the times that Jews are to offer the so-called Tamid sacrifice. Tamid means everlasting covenant. Look what Exodus says. Now this is what you shall regularly offer on the altar. 2 yearling lambs as a sacrifice established for each day, 1 lamb in the morning and the other lamb at the evening twilight. With the first lamb there shall be 1/10 of an ephah of bran flour mixed with 1/4 of a hin of oil and crushed olives, and as its libation 1/4 of a hin of wine. Excuse me. The other lamb you shall offer at the evening twilight with the same grain offering and libation as in the morning. You shall offer this as a sweet-smelling oblation to the Lord. Throughout your generations, this regular burnt offering shall be made before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of the meeting, that's the temple, where I will meet you and I will speak to you. In other words, what the book of Exodus is saying, that every day, at 9 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon, Jews have to go to the temple. The priest offers a lamb, sacrifices a lamb, and an offering of bread and wine. The priests make this offering, but the Jews go and pray in union with that offering that the priests are making. What does that sound like? A priest makes an offering and people pray in union with the priest that God accept that offering. What else? What does that remind you of? Remind you of the Mass, right? This would be offered at 9 in the morning and at 3 in the afternoon. That's Exodus. Exodus, again, you read it, you kind of tend to say, what, a hint of what? The Mishnah spells it out in much greater detail. There's almost an entire well, not an entire chapter, but an entire section giving you the instruction about how to carry on this Tamid sacrifice. And again, Tamid means perpetual offering, because you do this twice a day, every day, forever, forever. So Mark is emphasizing for us that Jesus, his passion begins and ends at the time of the Tamid sacrifice, at the very time that the Jews would be in the temple offering lamb along with bread and wine. Now, okay, Jews do this today, even devout Jews, Orthodox Jews. The Jews do this back in the time of Jesus. They sure did. In the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2 and chapter 4, it tells us that Peter and James would go up to the temple daily at the 3rd hour and at the 9th hour to pray with the other Jews with the offering of the Tamid sacrifice. So while Jesus is dying on the cross on the 9th hour, the Jews are in the temple praying this Tamid offering of a lamb and bread and wine. And there's a little bit more. For the second one, the one at 3 p.m., when you offer that 3 p.m. sacrifice, you would add a sequence of prayers, benedictions called the Amidah prayers. They're actually, Amidah simply means standing prayers, because you stand while you say them. They were also called the 18, because they initially started as the 18 benedictions. The last I've seen, they're up into the 20s today. It's like kind of like the rosary, for centuries it was 3 mysteries. Now we've got a 4th and so forth, so people have been adding on to it. But these are well-established Jewish prayers. They are in every Jewish prayer book. They are part of every Orthodox Jewish liturgy. If you want to call it a liturgy, it's liturgical what they do. Those 18 benedictions, one of them is the Birkat David, the blessing of David, which prays that the Messiah will come and save Israel. As Jesus dies on the cross at 3 o'clock, the Jews are in the temple praying that God would send the Savior to save Israel. How about that? How about that? You can't make this up. It's almost as though that this book we call the Bible is inspired, isn't it? It's almost as though, like, from the beginning of time, God had a plan. I'll tell you, the more I study this, and I love studying this stuff, I just absolutely love studying this stuff. I don't say this to offend anyone, but I don't understand how anybody who knows any of this could not belong either to a Catholic or an Orthodox church. I mean, I include the Orthodox as any church that has a valid Eucharist. It seems that from the beginning of ever, God's plan was for the Savior of the world to establish the Eucharist as the means of salvation. I just don't get it. I don't get it. How any Protestant could stay a Protestant if they know he is. But again, I don't say that, to affect. I was once of that mind myself. Well, they have their. It's no. Once you understand what this is all about, this faith of ours, the Catholic faith, is the only one that makes any sense. It really does. And the Orthodox too, because we're sisters with the Orthodox churches, right? They have a valid Eucharist. Yes.
So at 3 o'clock, when they were all having their mead, and Jesus died on the cross, and then it said the curtain in the temple was torn in two.
Yeah, this is the new covenant now established in a certain sense, that no more would there be restrictions about who could enter that Holy of Holies, right? No more you had to be a male Jew and you had to be able to have a son, and no, it was now torn. That barrier that existed was torn in two.
So so they were all there praying,
Yeah.
and sacrificing this. So when then all of a sudden this happened.
That's right. Well,
Actually, and it was
That's-
torn from the top.
From the top.
that's right. That's right. And this curtain, well, it's not a curtain. We don't have it's not a the curtain. If you look at again the people who study these things, this cloth was. I mean, this is like inch thick cloth, or 2 inch thick. This is heavy duty stuff here. That it's not a curtain. It's more like a wall that was.
What did they think? I don't remember really hearing anything else more about this. I mean, I'm sure I'm missing a lot.
Did you see that?
About the earth. There have been books written about the earthquake in Matthew's gospel, okay? So maybe we could save that for next year's topic, because literally there have been books written about it.
Wasn't there something somewhere that after 3 long hours on the cross, Jesus died? So if he was crucified at 9 in the morning, that makes it more than 3 hours.
No, he hung on the cross, it began at 9 o'clock and he died at 3 o'clock, so, the 3 is the time he died.
From
What-
12 to 3.
Now, whether he was actually crucified at 9, I may have to check, or did he begin the journey?
Crucified at 12 and 9 was when he was.
12, yeah, so 9 o'clock probably is when the sentencing and then the journey to Calvary and the fall, Jesus fell the 3rd time and all, that's all happening from 9 to, and then they get to 12, and he's already nailed at that point, and then it goes up, and then he spends 3 hours and dies.
And also the tearing of the curtain in the temple, when you have a great issue of blasphemy or even death, it was significant to tear your robe and show the great mourning.
Yeah.
And so one interpretation is that God, in front of all of his people, the ultimate mourning and the
God
ultimate
tore
blessing.
God tore his, because that temple was the sign of God's presence, it was the
Right.
Ark of the Covenant at that point, but still, that was it. Yeah. I say there's so much we could talk about here, so much.
Wasn't, I thought that, wasn't the temple destroyed too?
In 70 AD,
Sorry?
70 AD by the Romans.
70 years later.
70, well, it's 30 years, like 30 years later.
No, I mean, the earthquake. Wasn't there some rumbling or something?
Yeah, it was,
in
yeah,
the
but
temple?
the temple wasn't destroyed, the temple survived.
Yeah, but there was some rumbling in the.
There was an earthquake, yes, that's, we're talking about the earthquake that tore the temple and the curtain in the Holy of Holies, yeah. But it didn't destroy the temple, that continued. All right, let's finish up, it's getting late. What happened on Holy Saturday? We're finished with Good Friday. There's so much more we could talk. What happened on Holy Saturday? I'll give the cocky answer and say, nothing.
Jesus rested.
Jesus was a Jew. He rested on the Sabbath in his body. His body remained in the tomb on Saturday.
He
The
was the
Sabbath.
hell on
Now, his body remained in the tomb. His soul did something else, and we get into the whole business about descended into hell and all that. But Jesus, the good Jew, rested on the Sabbath in his body. He did nothing. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, can I just elaborate on something, because I don't know if I believe that, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but even in the stories about the Shroud of Turin, about all the blood and everything on the Shroud of Turin, they speculate that was done through electromagnetic, whatever was going on with him in hell, has what happening,
That
I don't know, I'm just thinking that there was more that was going on that Saturday than just him resting, but I mean.
well, no. It actually makes very good sense, because look at the timing of all this. This is all to Jesus finishes the work of salvation on Friday, the 6th day. The 7th day, he rested. The 8th day, the 1st day. What happened on the 1st day? Go back to the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was a formless void. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God began his work of creation on the 8th day, the 1st day, 8th day and the 1st day. The Beatles had it right, 8 days a week, right? On the 1st day, God again begins his new creation on the 1st day. On the 1st day, once again, the new Adam The new Adam, God says, let there be light. And the light emerges from the tomb. The light overcame the darkness. The darkness did not overcome the light. That's why Easter Sunday. You could ask the question, why not? Why did he wait? Why not rise Friday? He got died on Friday. They put him in the tomb. Why not just come right back out? Why spend the whole day Saturday why Easter Sunday? God's order of creation. On the first day, God creates and says, let there be light. And that's the day that the new Adam, the light of Christ, emerges from the tomb. That's why we observe our worship day not on the Sabbath, the seventh day, but on the first day, the day that Christ came out of the tomb. So yes, you're right. I mean, if you look at the catechism and so forth, Christ did a lot on that Saturday in his spirit, right? But his body laid in the tomb. His body observed the Sabbath. He rested. Enough, huh? What time? Very good. 2 hours. I said an hour, it's 2 hours. We got through all of Holy Week. We did that. Other questions, comments, rude remarks? No. Rude remarks, yeah.
Sometimes I have, in the creed, it says that Jesus rose the second time. There's a part of the creed where, hopefully, and on the second day he rose again from the dead.
The third day.
Third day, he rose again from the dead. So why does it say again?
It says again.
Yeah.
Let me think. On the third day he rose again from the dead. Why does it say again in there? Not sure.
It is. I even went to the catechism to figure this out, and I brought it up in Bible study too, and we were all kind of perplexed.
Let me look into that again thing. Let me check the Greek, because I want to see what it says in the Greek before I comment on it.
I thought maybe they meant his soul, because his soul went to
Well,
hell.
that's what I'm thinking, his body, while his body was lying in the tomb, his soul went into hell, which is the length. Sometimes people translate that, if they don't say he descended into hell, they say he descended to the dead.
Right,
Because
to
they
the
want to
land.
avoid the confusion that the hell wasn't the hell of the damned. This was the hell of the people who died before the sacrifice on Calvary. So these souls were just the souls trapped in the land of the dead that Jesus then freed. And so he had to leave that in his soul. And then after he did that on Saturday and Sunday, he rose from the grave. But I'll check the...
Yeah, that makes more sense to me.
Other questions?
The land of the dead, isn't that the
Sheol.
Gehenna?
Gehenna, fires of Gehenna is the garbage dump. That kind of speaks of the hell of the damned.
Okay.
Sheol would be the land of the dead.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you for listening for 2 hours. I was going to go, no. Oh, I want to give you some, if you want to read more, I want to give you, if you like to read books, I'm going to give 3 references for you that you can find a lot of this stuff in. They're all by the same person, a wonderful scholar named Grant Petrie. One of his books is called Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Eucharist. Excellent. I think Suzette, where did Suzette go? Suzette loved this book. You loved this book, didn't you? Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Eucharist. The other he wrote is The Case for Jesus. Excellent book. And then finally, Jesus the Bridegroom. These are all phenomenal books. Easy to read, very scholarly.
What is his name?
Brant Pitre.
He's awesome.
Didn't you write the case for Christ too?
No, that's really
The Case for Jesus. And then, of course, there's the Mishnah, the Talmud I left at home, Josephus. The Talmud is a huge set. If you want any of the papers, Abba isn't daddy, or the how you put a lamb on a spit to roast it.